I always look at stuff and say, well, Star Wars began in the theater, and it really exploded out from there. And we're so used to having a Star Wars film as a big driver behind everything else that we had in the franchise. One of my favorite periods of Star Wars, because now there are many periods of Star Wars, would have been in the prequel era, when and something I vividly remember in that period was I would see The Phantom Menace, but then there were all of the books and all of the games and all of the things surrounding it related to that. And you could be with all that other material all the way up to Attack the Clones. Then we'd go watch that movie together, and then we'd go back and you'd all the more books and all the more games, all things. And so there's a massive community around it, all kind of generated towards the same thing. And I'm very interested in that, and I think it's something that the movie provides, that big driver. And George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars, as it's not just it starts in the theater and then it trickles out everywhere in a wonderful way. There's this notion that everything changed and when everything became Legends, and I can see why people think that. But having worked with George, I can tell you that it was always very clear, and he made it very clear, that the films and the TV shows were the only thing that he considered canon. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. Everything else was a world of fun ideas, exciting characters, great possibilities, but the EU was created to explore all those things. And I know, and I fully respect people's opinion about it, that some of the material said the next canon part of it, okay, but from the filmmaking world that I was brought into, the TV series, the films were it. Mm-hmm. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. So it was not a big change for me when everyone was saying everything's Legend status now. I'm like, yeah, that's what I've always understood. It's all Legend status. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars.
First of all, when we were writing those books, we were told we were writing canon. So at that time, we were creating canon. And so anybody who says they were never canon is just incorrect.
George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars.
I had a long talk with Mr. Lucas out at Skywalker Ranch about Revenge of the Sith. And I asked him a lot of questions. We spent a lot of time talking about Jedi and how he wanted the book to feel and stuff like that. And in those days there was none of this kind of canon wars stuff that came about later on.
Right.
It was all canon. Everything published was canon.
George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars.
What kind of material did Lucasfilm provide you to give you an ability to write that? Did you get a preview of the film or something?
I had the script for the film, and I also had the ear of George Lucas on that one. So any time that I had a question about a character or I needed permission to take the story in a certain direction, I'd have that input from him.
George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars.
He allowed us to give Darth Vader a secret apprentice, which from a canon standpoint is just fantastic.
George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars.
How many characters of that Star Wars family exist today?
Well, today there's over 5,000 characters. It's very big, and we have lots of novels, lots of comic books, lots of games, and the movies and TV series, and there's a whole world of Star Wars now that didn't exist.
So is there a book we could all buy so we can know where they were born, who their parents were, what their special powers are, what their neuroses?
There's a lot of them. There's got to be at least 24 encyclopedias. And there's encyclopedias to characters, or encyclopedias to aliens, encyclopedia to droids, to spaceships. And then there's the complete Star Wars encyclopedia, which is in 4 volumes, big. It looks like the Encyclopedia Britannica. And it's just like it. It's got, just got thousands and thousands of entries.
George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars.
And obviously we have hundreds of books and comics and everything you could possibly imagine.
George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars.
The original saga was about the father, the children, and the grandchildren. And I mean, that's not a secret to anybody. It's even in the novels and everything.
George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars.
Dave Filoni and I once had this argument that educated me greatly, because I was all concerned. There was this thing I was recording as Darth Maul for this audiobook, and it wasn't, strictly speaking, consistent with something that we did in Clone Wars. Right. And I said, Dave, what should I do? Should I tell them to change the line? Should I blah, blah? What do you think? And how do I solve this problem? And he just said, Sam, it's good if the stories are different. Well, what do you mean? It has to be consistent. He's like, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. These are all tall tales. And they all of the tellings, it's great if it's a little bit different. That's reason to go seek that out, to get a different perspective on the same story. This campfire that night that was told that story, this happened and Ahsoka's lightsaber was blue. But over here, you heard the same story and Ahsoka's lightsaber was green. And that's good. And when I thought about what he said, I'm like, he's right.
People get into all these debates of what's canon, what's not, and sometimes forget just the special nature of telling a good story.
George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars.
It's official. It's part of the official canon. Everything is canon. The novels, the comics, the video games. It's all there. We want it to be a continuous, one single universe where everything we try to make things fit as well as possible. And then when things crop up, we take it case by case.
George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars. George understood that type of ecosystem for Star Wars.